Eating flowers, at least squash and pumpkin flowers, isn't one of the things that most of us associate with this time of year, but this is actually the perfect time to do it. In the springtime, you want to keep as many of those flowers around as possible because you want them to grow into pumpkin or squash later on. But this time of year, when you don't have enough time for the fruit to put on and actually make a pumpkin or a squash, it's a real good time. So you can have a lot of these this time of year if you choose to. What we're going to do today is turn the flowers into basically a kind of a fritter or a fried pumpkin flour. In order to do that, I'm going to start with 1 1/3 cups of all-purpose flour, and if you chose to, you could mix that with some whole wheat, or you could even use all whole wheat if you wanted it to be a little bit higher in fiber. A teaspoon of salt, and it's a little bit humid today, so we'll shake that out of there. 2 tablespoons of sugar, about a tablespoon of vegetable oil, and 2 egg yolks. Now, fritter batters, just like all batters, are apt to absorb a lot of the fat that's around them. And adding egg yolks to it will reduce the amount of fat that you absorb in the batter itself. Now, of course, that's going to add some cholesterol to it, but it's going to be kind of a trade-off because a lot of fat in your diet will raise your blood cholesterol levels too. And to that, we're going to add somewhere between 3/4 to a cup of buttermilk. Depending on the weather and how long it's going to sit, the batter will absorb different amounts of the buttermilk. The reason we're using buttermilk instead of plain milk is that the buttermilk is partly fermented, and we don't want the batter to be too strong, so that we want to have time for that fermentation to take place, and the buttermilk being partly fermented sort of spurs that on. Now, you could do the same thing with other ingredients. A lot in fact, of fritter recipes call for beer, but if you don't happen to have that around or you don't want to have that around, this works real well. Now, stirring it till it's fairly smooth is important. Now, that does develop the gluten, make the batter stronger, but we're going to let this rest, and the buttermilk in combination here with the flour will break some of that gluten down, pre-digest it, so to speak, so that the batter will soften up and be more apt to adhere to the flours later on. We do this and then we let this sit somewhere between 2 to 12 hours. If you don't have that much time before you're going to use it, you need to make sure you don't overmix it or it's going to end up being way too stiff. Now, this batter has sat for the 2-hour time period. I'm going to go ahead and turn my fat on here. A lot of these recipes call for deep fat frying, and what we're going to do is a little bit different today in that we're going to pan fry it so that it doesn't have quite as much fat to it. You could also do this if you don't want to follow this particular recipe. There's a couple of other ways this could be done. Here you see the flours. We're going to take the little pieces off here that aren't especially good to eat and get rid of those. You could just dip these in water or milk and then roll them in flour or dredge them in flour. Or you could use just a regular pancake batter because that's basically what this is anyway. Now, we're going to dip this in here, and I'm going to leave the stems on if I can, if it doesn't break off on me, so that we have something to make it look a little bit prettier, hold on to while you're eating it. Shake off any excess batter. Now, my fat really is not quite hot enough. You want it to be a little bit of splatter to it when you drop a bit of the batter into it, so you'd want to let your fat heat up a little bit more than mine will be. Then lay that in there. And it should sizzle when you put it in, and this is just starting to. Now, I have found that the smaller flours are a little bit easier to work with, and those that are closed up a little bit more easier to work with. If you were deep fat frying, then having them open would work a little bit better, but since we're pan frying and I'm having them closed so that they lay flat tends to work a little bit better. Now, one of the interesting things that happens with these flours is the nutrition changes that occur as you go from flour to actual pumpkin and then on to the seeds. At the flour stage itself, there's only about 5 calories in an entire cup. There's no fat, so you don't have any of those kinds of problems going with you. And the vitamin A content is really fairly small. When you get to be a pumpkin, you have about 24 calories in a half a cup, but you have about as much vitamin A as you need for the whole day in that 1 cup of pumpkin. You still have no fat. When you move on to the seed stage, you end up with close to 300 calories in about a half a cup of the seeds, and almost all of that is going to be in the form of fat. So you get a lot of change as you go from one stage in the plant to another. Now, if the stems are still on there, you can use them a little bit. You want to turn these about once. Also, make sure as much as possible that the flours are as dry as possible before you put them in here. You can see this is splattering a little bit, and part of that is probably because the batter's a little bit wet, and also because the flours are still a little bit moister than they should be. It should look about like you would do a pancake when it's about done. You turn it over about that same stage in the process. Once these are done, we want to drain them. You may want to wear an apron or at least some older clothes so that if you do have fat splatter, you won't have anything getting real dirty. I'd probably let this brown up a little bit more if we were going to use it for home. But since we're short on time here, we're going to go ahead and use them now. And we want to drain them on a paper towel so that we get as much of that fat off as possible. And then one of the things that you can do with them after they have drained well is go ahead and sprinkle a little bit of powdered sugar on them. You could also use other things. If you're going to use it in a main course instead of as a dessert, you could put a little curry powder on there or other kinds of seasonings and herbs to give it a little bit different taste. If this isn't what you want to do with the pumpkins that you've grown, you have some other alternatives. Pumpkin bread, pumpkin pie, of course, is a favorite, and pumpkin cookies. This is another one of the recipes that you can get if you contact your county extension agent. For Oklahoma Gardening, this is Barbara Brown.